Good morning. It's 10:30 on Thursday in Houston, and that must mean another of the Center for Carbon Management and Energy webinars. We've been doing this for the month of April and this one into May now. And the topic today, I think you'll find quite interesting. And we'll speak about it in today's webinar. But I think for all of you joining us today, we'll welcome those that haven't attended before, and those that have been attending. We certainly appreciate your continued support of the Carbon Management Center and these webinars. It's great to have you with us. We, as I said, we've been doing this for the past month or so. Really promoting the fundamental principles of the Center for Carbon Management. My name's Chuck McConnell, and responsible for the Center for Carbon Management and Energy. We are dedicated to a fundamental principle of the necessary three elements of the energy trilemma. That is to be able to provide energy to those in need anywhere in the world and do it reliably. Also to deliver that energy in an environmentally responsible manner. And certainly the carbon management activities of many of the major corporations and efforts in governments and society around the world, critical to delivering that environmental performance. And the third leg on the stool really is delivering energy in a cost competitive manner. The competitiveness of energy choices is critical to people in society for their own needs, for manufacturing and global competitiveness, for any company making products, for any nation competing on a global scale. And so we're dedicated to the principles that there isn't one technology, there isn't one solution. There is a need for all technologies, all fuels, and what we focus on are the emissions, not the fuels and feedstocks. And based upon that, give ourselves the ability to select the best choices. I want to offer another final thank you for the sponsorship of Hunt and Andrews and Kurth throughout the month of April and for our web series that we've had up to this point. They are a founding member of our Carbon Management Center. They have provided a tremendous amount of support, not only in the formation of the organization and providing financial contribution, but also in the thought leadership, as their organization has moved forward in a number of different ways in the legal frameworks of the renewable industry, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, many of the legal frameworks necessary to enable the energy transition. And we're very grateful for the sponsorship that Hunton has provided. Like for you all to recognize that the series of webinars that we've had since the beginning of April, you may not have been able to attend all of them. We have them archived on our CCME web page. The link here shown on this screen. The webinars are archived, as is, by the way, the series of white papers that has been associated with several of the presentations, including today's. We'll speak more about that in a moment. But please visit our website, see not only about the archived webinars, but also the activities, ways that you can get involved with the Center for Carbon Management, how your organization can participate and be involved with something we believe to be transformative in the marketplace. And that's really spoken to by our members and those that are a part of our center. So please visit our website and learn more about us. While we're doing today's session, I'll finish these opening remarks and we'll listen to about a 40-minute presentation that will be presented on today's topic. During that presentation, feel free to use the chat button on your Zoom connection here. And by the way, you may wish to go to the upper right-hand corner and ensure that you choose the speaker view. That way you'll be able to see all the presentation material as well as the speaker boxes. So please make use of that. But use the chat function during the presentation. We'll gather up those questions so that at the end of it, the formal presentation, we'll have a live Q&A. It'll be roughly 30 minutes or so. We'll try to group those questions so that we can cover as big of a landscape as possible. And in fact, during the Q&A, you'll be able to submit continued questions and participate that way as well. The more we get in terms of questions and answering what it is that's on your mind, it's likely to be a better and more interactive discussion. So I'd like to introduce our featured speaker today, Greg Bean, who's the Executive Director of the Gutierrez Energy Management Institute at our Bauer College of Business. Greg has a long, rich history in the energy industry outside of academia, but he has taken a big leadership at our Bauer School to make a lot of the critical interactions, relationships with leading companies in the energy industry. Today's presentation is the digitization of the energy industry. Greg recently authored a white paper along with support from several of the colleagues here in UH Energy about the digitalization of the energy industry. That white paper is already posted on our website, and if you haven't read it already, you may find this conversation interesting and want to pursue more detail, and there's quite a bit there. Great topic, certainly timely in terms of where the industry is going. And in Greg's presentation today, it's very simple. He does a really good job of laying out the presentation today with a standard business approach to answering the 5 questions that begin with a W. What is it? The key components and functions of digitization. Who, what kind of companies are doing it? What kind of people are involved in it? What are the characteristics of those that are employing digitization and being able to actually utilize this capability in their workplace? Why are they doing it? Well, you'll see there's a tremendous amount of impact. It's bottom line based. It's not a science experiment. It's incredibly important to the business performance. It's all about efficiency and it's all about cost. Where is it being done? It's across the spectrum of the energy industry. There are leaders, there are followers, there are some laggards. And as you look across the board in the electric power industry, the petrochemical industry, the oil and gas industry, which makes up the large majority of, frankly, the members of our Carbon Management Center, but the landscape of carbon emitters, carbon producers, carbon utilizers, and really ultimately the solutions that exist for the future in terms of being able to do carbon management in an effective way. And finally, we'll ask the question as part of the presentation, when will this be happening? In some regards, it's happening today. There's a lot of enthusiasm moving forward, but in any circumstance like this, it's early, and some are taking a much more bold approach. But in any case, those that are deploying this are at the tip of the spear and certainly leading in terms of the way they address the marketplace. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Greg, his formal presentation. And as I said, during his presentation, feel free to submit your questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, and good morning. I'd like to share with you some research and the results of a recent symposium we've held at the Bauer College of Business on digitalization of the energy industry. Before I review that research, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the Bauer College of Business and the Gutierrez Energy Management Institute, which manages the energy program at Bauer. The Bauer College of Business is the largest college at the university. We have about 6,700 students, about 5,800 undergraduate and 900 graduate students. We have 5 academic departments and 8 institutes, of which GEMI is one. A unique feature of the University of Houston is we have the most diverse undergraduate population in the United States, and about 85% of our students are from the greater Houston area. I am the director of the Gutierrez Energy Management Institute, and we are responsible for the energy education and outreach programs at Bauer. We provide energy-related degrees, degree tracks, certificate and courses, and have a major focus on helping students who are interested in energy have experiential learning opportunities, and we provide them with career development support as they attempt to further their careers in the energy industry. And as represented by the symposium and research that we've done that we're going to talk about, we undertake research in business matters of interest to the university, and we provide symposiums and other opportunities to discuss significant industry issues in a neutral setting. So with that overview of Bauer and GEMI, I'd like to talk about the results of the survey and the symposium. Before I do that, brief introduction on digitalization. Digitalization has several key components that we'll be talking about, and I think this is a helpful way to think about what is really a broad scope when you use the term digitalization. Really in 3 main buckets: computers, connectivity, sensors and data, and software. And the evolution of all of those things has resulted in the ability for digitalization to now have a significant impact on the energy industry very broadly. This is the results of a Futures of Jobs report that was done a couple of years ago by the World Economic Forum. They surveyed a number of companies across all industries in terms of, as part of their trying to understand what the needs of the workforce of the future were, what kind of technologies that companies were adopting. And when you look at this list, one of the things that you notice is how many of these technologies are digital related. Whether it's big data analytics, Internet of Things, cloud computing, augmented and virtual reality, wearables, many of the technologies that are at the top of companies' lists across industries are digital related, and hence the importance of digitalization in the industry and for us who are involved in helping students prepare to enter the industry. So all of those new technologies are creating a number of new roles that we're seeing that companies are looking to be filled as part of their implementation of digitalization initiatives. Out of that same report, this is a list of new digital related roles, and we are seeing many of these materialize, demand for those materialize in the different segments of the energy industry, whether they are big data or machine learning specialists, process automation specialists, robotics specialists, information security analyst. All of these skills, these technologies that companies are looking to implement in their initiatives are requiring them to create new digitalization roles within their companies. Those roles and technologies that we show were being adopted across industries. If we look a little bit more specifically at the energy industries, and here we have data for both the overall adoption of technology, which we showed previously in the first column, but then specifically the percentage of oil and gas companies and then electric utility companies that were surveyed, to see how that compared and contrasted with the average, so to speak, industrial company. And so what we've done is highlighted in blue the areas where oil and gas and or electric utility companies were significantly more likely than the average to adopt these various technologies. And I think this generates some interesting results, particularly pointing to things like the Internet of Things, cloud computing, augmented and virtual reality, wearables, 3D printing, robotics, quantum computing. There are a number of these technologies where, in fact, the expected adoption rate in energy companies is greater than it is in the average of companies across all industries. So we're very interested in understanding about the specific demands of energy companies as they conduct digitalization initiatives, and then how does that translate into how we need to prepare our students. In terms of what companies think they will achieve by digitalizing their businesses, they really expect to have a significant impact across their business. And this was another survey that was done, and companies were asked, where do they see digitalization having a significant impact? And it's interesting that in really 4 of the main areas of their operations, whether it's asset operations management, capital project development, planning, project construction and engineering, or even managing end-of-life issues with assets, they expect digitalization to have a significant impact in all those areas across the company operation. In terms of what do companies think will be the main impact as opposed to where, what will be the main impact? Energy companies believe that improving efficiency and reducing costs are likely to be the areas of most impact to them. And this would be quite different than a number of other industries where perhaps creating new products and services, enhancing customer relationships would be priorities for them. But for energy companies, they are pretty clearly expecting that the main return they'll get for their investments is on improving efficiency and reducing costs. So I mentioned that we'd done some research and also held a symposium. The symposium was held on late last year and on the topic of the potential nature and impact of digitalization, specifically in the energy industry. As I mentioned, it's expected to have a significant impact on the industry. The World Economic Forum has estimated a potential $2 trillion impact on the industry over 10 years. The purpose of our symposium was really to help us understand and get different perspectives on what are some of the trends and identify business opportunities and challenges that would come as a result of the emergence of these digitalization technologies. And as is typical of our symposiums, which are done twice a year, this one included a broad range of representatives, including industry executives from oil and gas, renewable energy and power, representatives of our faculty from our different colleges here, and industry research firms, investment banks, and nonprofits. So a pretty broad group of about 60 people. And the event includes both some context-setting remarks from some subject matter experts, as well as participants then working in small groups to exchange and develop insights in a number of areas. And following some of what you'll see are some of the insights that came out of those groups collectively. And we conduct these symposia under Chatham House rules, whereby no attribution of any specific idea is made to either an individual or a company. And in fact, the participating companies are not explicitly identified. We found that this format allows individuals to really have in-depth discussions which reflect their experience and their expertise, without regard to what extent is that significant with their consistent, with the public posture of the company. So one of the things that we asked the symposium attendees to discuss and prioritize was what were the applications what were the technologies that they thought, and then what were the applications of those technologies that would have the highest impact across the energy industry. And this is a summary of those. And again, this was a prioritization based on the symposium group, but very interestingly, very consistent with the broader survey results that I showed earlier, which was across a large number of energy companies around the world. Technologies around advanced data analytics, AI, and machine learning, very high potential impact. The symposium attendees believed. Examples of that, and these are just illustrative examples that people mentioned, of new methods for exploration of oil and gas, and new methods for optimization of downstream operations, marketing, procurement operations. There's already work being done and some of the applications actually implemented in some energy companies and segments, and the participants felt like this was an area which was going to see a very high impact across the industry. Cloud computing and open source data, the impact of that being facilitating the management of multi-stakeholder capital projects. As we know, many capital investments that are undertaken by the energy industry are undertaken jointly with partner companies and sometimes with governments. And the participants believe that cloud computing, open source data could be helpful in better managing those projects. And then another interesting application that was mentioned was allowing for the demonstration of the sustainability of energy products or particular processes, which would be backed by real-time environmental impact monitoring, as that becomes more of an issue and more of a requirement for energy companies. The participants felt like this technology could be of great value to that. Data visualization tools, various aspects of operations, whether it's facility energy or emissions data or other plant data, blockchain, distributed ledger technology, people felt was going to have a significant impact on commodity trading and risk management. And again, interestingly, another application related to sustainability was using blockchain to create sustainable product certificates and facilitate the training of those. Safety applications, this is an area where many of these technologies are already being deployed by energy companies, and whether that's aerial drones or underwater vehicles, which are used extensively in the upstream industry today, wearables as well, a number of safety applications the participants in the symposium felt would be very high impact. Then longer term quantum computing, given the complexity of many energy operations and energy systems, a belief that the energy industry would have a significant impact by having the increase in computing power that would allow more complex modeling and operations of large complex systems. And finally, robotics, where participants felt that in both inspection as well as in equipment manufacturing in the industry, robotics was potentially a very high impact application. So those were the priorities that were identified by the symposium with respect to industry applications. We then asked the symposium participants to talk a little bit about where they saw the impact in the different segments of the energy industry, starting first with oil and gas. And the consensus was that the expected impact in upstream oil and gas was going to be great, and was going to be great across the entire upstream value chain. And this is an illustration and some estimates that were put together by BCG, which I think was consistent with the thinking of the participants, showing that in fact would have significant impact exploration via some of the interpretation and machine language learning technologies, field development, a number of applications there, using analytics to improve well design and drilling, and then optimizing operations and maintenance by getting real-time data and advanced models to both optimize production as well as improve maintenance efforts. So the upstream industry was believed by the participants to be an area of significant impact. Midstream as well, but in different ways. The symposium really identified two areas or types of impacts, and the first was related to the fact that many of the midstream systems and assets that we have, particularly in the U.S., are aging, and as a result, they are subject to concerns over license to operate issues, and a belief that those aging assets, they're more vulnerable, leading to potential outages and HSE impacts and costs, and a belief that digitalization technologies could significantly help reduce those possible outages and hence costs. So one specific area for midstream was around helping mitigate the risks of aging assets. The second one was around complex optimization and an appreciation for the fact that midstream has many complex geographically distributed assets. And while those today have differing levels of digitalization, was a view that this could be an area of significant additional impact. And the participants talked about the kind of subsegments of the midstream industry. And the consensus was that terminal operations are the most digitalized today, partially as a result of the complexity of the operations of managing a decent-sized terminal. And so those, while the most complex within the midstream, the group felt there was still a significant potential impact on more advanced digitalization technologies there. And of the remaining assets where trunk lines and processing plants are typically more mature than gathering systems, a belief that there was potential to have a significant jump in performance and improvement in those areas, and then a belief that there was an opportunity just to do a better job of integration overall. So different impacts in midstream and different impacts within the types of midstream assets, but a belief that those impacts would be significant. Finally, with respect to oil and gas, the group felt that the downstream was likely to remain at the leading edge of digitalization. The group was consistent in the belief that in their experience that refineries and to the same extent chemical plants, because of the complexity of their processes and operations, were the first to embrace digital technology going back to the 1960s, and automation and complex process optimization. And as a result, have really been on the leading edge of that with respect to the oil and gas industry, and a belief that there were still significant impact available from new technologies, things like advanced data analytics, robotics, virtual and augmented reality technologies, and that those could be deployed across the different aspects of the downstream value chain, as is shown in this chart with more detail, which is again also an illustration by BCG as well. So that's the oil and gas sector. Interestingly, turning to power, the group, Symposium group, believed that the electric power industry was likely to have the biggest sector of all, and that's actually very consistent with some analysis that was done here a couple of years ago by the World Economic Forum in conjunction with Accenture, which looked at the cumulative value to society and industry of digitalization technologies in different industries. And as you can see, clearly the consumer industry is expected to have the single biggest impact of the energy-related sectors. Electricity was deemed or estimated to have this single biggest impact, and a bigger impact collectively than oil and gas. And again, this data really supported the beliefs of the Symposium members in their thinking about where the biggest impact would be. Interestingly as well, the electricity sector was deemed by the World Economic Forum analysis to actually have the biggest net increase in the number of jobs as a result of deployment of digitalization technology. Getting a little bit more into the details of where that opportunity is for within the electric power sector, really the World Economic Forum analysis focused on four main areas: asset lifecycle management, grid optimization and aggregation, integrated customer services, and what they call beyond the electron, which is, new kind of personalized connective services in the energy space. As you can see by some of the descriptions, some of the opportunities that they identified, it's really quite a broad set of digitalization initiatives and impacts that they would expect to see in the electric power sector, and hence the belief that its impact in aggregate was likely to be the largest of the energy sectors. Our symposium group, we also asked them to think about new business models and new players. So what were the changes in business models and potential new entrants that might come as a result of the development and deployment of digitalization technologies? And again, here, the symposium groups believed that the electric power industry was the segment of the energy, within the energy industry, was the segment that was likely to see the biggest change in business models. This is a description of some illustrative potential business models that were developed by Strategy and, which were consistent with some of the concepts that were developed, that came out of our symposium. And the symposium group's thinking about this was the magnitude of the changes that were coming in the electric power sector with respect to a move to clean power, like clean energy, renewable power generation, the advent of distributed generation and the need for energy or electricity storage, supporting the build out of the electric vehicle networks, and other home and business related services. Those changes were what the symposium believed were going to drive some of the changes in or the development of new business models. And here, there are just three examples here, which were developed by Strategy and, which I think were consistent with the thinking of significant changes in business models in the electric industry that came out of our symposium. In terms of new players, we asked the symposium participants what types of companies did they think were likely to emerge. Who were the new players that were likely to come in and potentially get significant business opportunity and market share as a result of digitalization? And the symposium identified two main groups. The first, which we called industrial automation companies, and you can see the examples here. These are companies that are well known as hardware and to some extent software providers to the energy industry today, but the symposium groups believed that these companies would make significant investments to expand, their emerging digital service offerings, a lot of which are around risk management, and they would be expanding those in the energy industry very aggressively. And there's a few examples here that came out of some reference material that was put together in an article by ZDNet. The second group that the symposium felt were likely to be major players as a result of digitalization was the cloud service providers, the Amazon, Google's, Microsoft's of the world, where the group expected them to significantly expand, their current operations and move more into higher end analytical AI, machine learning type operations where they could use a company's data to provide, those kind of services to a company. And we're starting to see some of that as well. So again, some illustrations here of what those companies might be offering with respect to services that will result from their capabilities in the digitalization technology space. In addition to those two types of established companies, the symposium participants believe that startups could play a significant role with some innovative digitally enabled services. This is a list of those that were developed by some research by the University of Cambridge in the UK. And you can see they are in a number of different areas, whether it's around carbon, engineered carbon management, grid, energy use and efficiency, financing. Very interesting that there are already startups operating in these areas, trying to develop and market these services using various different kind of digitalization technologies. So in addition to the industrial automation companies and the industry cloud providers, there was a belief that some of these startups will be successful and will evolve into being significant players in the energy industry as well. We've shown a lot of opportunity here in terms and a lot of potential impact as a result of the development and deployment of these digitalization technologies. But there are a lot of challenges to be overcome before these technologies can be really adopted and the benefits really be achieved. A number of areas listed here. These are some of the ones that were highlighted by the symposium participants around regulation, and particularly the symposium groups were thinking about some of the unmanned operations and whether they're, drones, robotics, other things like that, that the regulations that cover those were evolving, and that was something that was going to have to, be clarified before you could have widespread adoption of those. Some other areas around internal, the ways companies operate and deploy things internally, about experimentation, about being willing to change out legacy systems to implement the new digital technology systems, about systems integration, which I think was very interesting. A belief from the participants that, the energy industry has evolved to being, in some cases, quite siloed, and that the real benefit of some of these digital transformations are going to be where there is an end-to-end transformation, and that internal barriers and challenges could prove to be significant barriers to capturing the benefits of these new digitalization technologies. We talked a little bit about all of the new skills and roles that are going to be required. The symposium discussions were around, the potential lack of talent in the energy industry and the potential difficulty the industry might have in acquiring that talent. And then finally, cybersecurity, obviously, as we move to implementing all of these digitalization technologies, the complexity of security of those is something that the group felt was a very significant challenge that was going to have a significant level of effort. In terms of the skills that are required, as we look as educators and think about the impact of digitalization on the skill needs in the energy industry, we're already starting to see those skill requirements show up, in particular with respect to the types of postings that we are seeing online. And this is a study that was done, this is across all industries, not energy specific, that was done by Burning Glass Technologies and BCG, an analysis of online job postings. And it's interesting to note that, of the postings categories that had more than 100,000 different job postings over the course of 2018, 5 of those were digital related, as we see here. So this data is already 2 years old, but is already showing that the demand for those skill sets are starting to show up, which is something that we, of course, are very interested in. In addition to the digitalization skills, to really fully implement these technologies and get the benefits of them from a business perspective, there are a number of other non-digital competencies that the Symposium research came up with that they believed were going to be important. We've listed some of these here. A better understanding of sustainability and sustainable business models and how that translates into the operations of companies, better competency around risk management, more competency around innovation and entrepreneurship, lots of discussion around problem solving and critical thinking skills, and also finally a lot of discussion around the need for multidisciplinary collaboration and teamwork. The Symposium discussion groups really zeroed in on this with the idea that these opportunities are very complex, and to really capture the full value will need to be worked by multidisciplinary teams, and will need to be which will be required to really capture kind of end-to-end benefits that some of these technology applications will bring. So we also asked them to think a little bit about higher education and what was going on in higher education and how we ought to be perhaps thinking about preparing our students differently. And this discussion was preceded by a presentation by Ramanan around transforming the energy industry, one of our keynote speakers, and his assessment of the significant disconnect between how higher education is traditionally structured and the needs of the digitalized energy industry. And this really resonated with the Symposium participants in terms of how, in a number of dimensions, the desired system that we would like to have our higher education activities organized around is really quite different from the current system, as you can see here. And what we really need to take a step back in higher education and think about how is it that we give our students more knowledge and more experience in multidisciplinary real-world problem solving, critical thinking, effectively communicating and thinking about how to integrate digital technologies into the various aspects of the energy industry. And this really resonated with the symposium participants and has given us a lot of thinking to do about this. And Ramanand's thoughts, just to finish up on this, about some of the changes that we collectively in higher education need to make. The first one, which is something that we are already very focused on, is experiential learning for our students, both undergraduate and graduate. And in fact, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a big focus of the energy program in the Bauer and GEMI. And we regularly create opportunities for students to do business-oriented research, consulting projects. We help them find internships in the industry. We conduct team competitions. And we think that more of that will be required to help our students be better prepared to be, significant contributors in the digitalized energy industry of the future. Getting more PhD research internships in the industry, giving our PhD students more practical, real-world research type opportunities and experiences. Stackable certificate programs, and this is something that we are starting to develop at the university in terms of helping not just students, but alums and industry professionals get up to speed on technologies and help them maintain awareness of the latest state of technologies by building certificate programs that they could participate in. And some other potential suggestions as well that Raman put together. So this was a big takeaway for us in terms of thinking about, yes, the energy industry is going to be dramatically impacted by the full deployment of digitalization technologies. There's a significant impact, therefore, on their needs, the needs of their workforce, and we need to focus on that in higher education and make some changes to how we prepare students in order to better prepare them for that. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll turn it back over to Chuck for some discussion and Q&A.
Well, Greg, certainly a rich discussion of a lot of the activities going on in the marketplace. It certainly is developing and moving forward. It's always quite interesting to get those kind of insights when you have a group like that together, providing those kinds of unfettered feedback. I want to remind everybody, by the way, to use the chat button. We've gotten several very, very good questions in that we'll throw at you here in a moment, Greg. But again, feel free to use that chat button and continue on as we are in this portion of the Q&A. Maybe start at a high level, Greg. It's not just about today's environment. I mean, the price of oil is much, much lower than it's been in quite a while. A lot of economic pressure, demand destruction, everything else. I mean, it's all of those issues that one might get wrapped up in gloom and doom, but we've all been through cycles. And so we know that's not the norm. That's not what we need to fixate on. There'll be recovery, but all of that will evolve over time. But I think more fundamentally, as you talk about all of these actions that were contemplated in your group, a couple of things come to mind, and take them in whatever order you'd like. First of all, it seems as though the costs or the barrier for entry of adopting digitalization has to be significant. And maybe you can comment a bit on how organizations have chosen to work their way through that adoption. And then maybe the second question, maybe a little finer point on it, is a lot of this seems to me to be first world order challenges. But we've got a huge part of the world that is in energy poverty. And how might you see digitalization enabling the transformation of that part of the world faster, more efficiently, more effectively? And is there a leapfrogging, perhaps, of some of the investments that digitalization can enable to allow that to happen?
Okay, on your first question about the costs are significant. Certainly that is true. And particularly for trying to adapt some of these technologies to older or even aging assets. And I think that the companies are proceeding on the basis, as large energy companies do, in terms of looking at the cost versus the potential return. They see a lot of return in many areas just around efficiency gains, so cost reduction gains that can help them. In other cases, they can fairly easily quantify optimization benefits that are associated with that. The good news is that not only the breadth of these technologies is increasing, but the costs are gradually going down as we get players involved, providing more solutions. I think that's directionally driving the cost of these of implementing these technologies down. I think the big concern is really around the human capital side of this, and particularly for the energy industry, what is the cost of attracting the people with these new skills that can help them implement them, when many of those people would have opportunities in other industries that they might view as being more high tech. So I think that's the real challenge, is how do companies internally get the people that they need to manage the implementation of these technologies. Your second question is a good one. I think it's difficult in some aspects of the energy industry. It's easier to see where digitalization can have a big impact. I'm thinking particularly in the electric power sector, where combined with renewable power generation technology, and particularly distributed power generation technology, we could very well see a leapfrogging in a lot of developing countries who will be putting in distributed power generation systems rather than the more traditional centralized power distribution systems. And those are clearly enabled by a number of these different digitalization technologies. That's the one area that comes to mind where I think we could very well see a leapfrogging.
Well, along those lines, Greg, a greater reliance on the cyber world, the cloud, all of the things that we hear about. And there isn't one company that I've been interacting with for the last 10 years that doesn't have a concern about cybersecurity. This seems to me to be maybe moving more chips to that marker, if you will, in terms of your company strategy and investments, et cetera. What are the steps that you see industries taking to address those concerns?
Well, that's clearly a very big challenge, and I think that particularly the larger companies have extensive internal capabilities in cybersecurity, and also they work very closely with, the cloud providers. And I think when you look at the major cloud companies, clearly the whole viability of that expanding and being a large-scale business continuing to grow is around their being able to be at the leading edge of cybersecurity. So I think that is a clear concern, and one that the big energy companies, as well as the cloud providers and other technology companies, are working on.
Well, the energy industry, Greg, generally incredibly technology advanced, a phenomenal amount of effort and energy, but the adoption rate on new things is often slow, because it must be. I mean, you have to have guarantees of performance. It has to be safe and environmentally responsible, all those kinds of things. Let me ask a question, maybe as look at the data that you've given us. It seems as though the electric power industry may be further ahead in terms of rapid adoption of this. And the question I've got is, do you think that's because it directly affects their customers and the ability for customers to see value sooner? Or if not, what might be causing the skewing of that?
Well, Chuck, I think it really depends on the particular technologies you're talking about. I think the oil and gas companies are probably ahead of a lot of electric utilities in applying some of these digitalization technologies. Clearly, others which are more focused on customer-oriented, industries, as well as distributed assets, industries. Some of those technologies are probably being implemented a little bit more quickly than the electric power industry. But, I think the oil and gas companies have been, implementing many of these technologies, fairly early. I think that, a lot of the new computing technologies, a lot of the robotics, when you think about, the upstream, for example, and using, underwater robotics in deep water. I think if you think about midstream companies using pipeline, using, drones, and now other types of robotic inspection equipment, I think that you can point to a number of areas and say that where the oil and gas companies are, very current and in some cases leading edge. I think the consensus, or the numbers we showed about the long-term impact and potentially a greater impact globally on the electric power industry is really a function of the pervasiveness of the industry, and as opposed to the more centralized nature of big oil and gas assets. So I think that really leads to the idea of electric power ultimately having more benefit and getting more impact. But I think that's really more a function of scale, and to some extent also looking ahead to the increasing role of electricity in the mix, I think.
Greg, in the oil and gas segment, how would you characterize the progression or the leadership, if you will, in this digitalization activities, comparing national oil companies with international oil companies, with perhaps then independents and mid-majors? How would you characterize that just generally?
I can't speak to that broadly across a lot of the segments. I can say that if you look at the downstream industry, and here I'm thinking really more of the refining industry, which is where I started way back then. You know, the refining industry was the real pioneer in oil and gas, and in some cases across industries with respect to process automation and optimization. And there was a lag between how particularly what we now think of as the super majors invested in digitalization technology, which really goes back to the late 1960s and early 70s when some of the very basic technology came out, and the early applications, really some of the earliest applications in any industry, were in refineries in terms of setting up digital process control systems and things like that. Thinking about the lag that we saw between the majors and some of the national oil companies with respect to refining, yes, there was a lag. A lot of that really depended on the size and scale of the assets. You tended to see, more rapid, more leading edge process control and digitalization technology focused more on the larger assets, which tended to be owned by the majors, as opposed to some of the national oil companies. So there was definitely a lag there. I can't really comment too much on the upstream with respect to comparing the majors to the national oil companies, but I think it's important to understand or to remember that so much of the investment that's made in the upstream outside of North America is really made jointly by multiple companies, and very often with national oil company equity interest, and even operatorship in some cases. So I think I'm hypothesizing, I don't have data, I'm hypothesizing that the lag in the upstream is quite, is perhaps maybe not as much as we saw years ago in the downstream.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting though, isn't it, Greg, is that you've got national oil companies that are actually part of a country, as opposed to the international oil companies doing those ventures, not necessarily being affiliated directly with our government here in the US. You wonder about the commingling of that kind of sensitive computational information. And again, going back to that cybersecurity question, it's even more challenging when you're in a venture with someone that you want to be very, very attentive to all the business issues. And at the same time, you wonder about that whole back office that exists in a national oil company versus an international oil company. Or maybe I'm just being overly sensitive to that. I don't know.
No, I don't think so. I think particularly when you think about, say, cloud applications, I think on the one hand, there's a belief that that can significantly facilitate the management of partnerships in the upstream, everywhere, by making it easier for the various partners to have access to data and things like that. The flip side of that, and the challenge which a lot of, particularly some of the super majors are struggling with, I believe, is, where do I draw that line, and how do I make sure that I'm not inadvertently sharing, highly proprietary information around the subsurface and things like that. I think that is a big concern. And in addition to the general cybersecurity concern, and it's one of the reasons why there has been a little bit the move towards shared data formats, particularly in the upstream, has been fairly slow. We had some people talking about this at the Symposium who were both operating companies as well as service companies, talking about how there's a bit of a reluctance among some of the larger companies to even agree to standardized data formats, with the concern that that ultimately can lead to some data leakage, so to speak.
Well, decarbonization, Greg, is on everyone's mind. We've had several questions come in here regarding the impact of digitalization on carbon management generally. Do you see any particular areas that came out of that discussion that were at the top of the list, or is that still being put into a strategic framework?
No, I think there are a number of thoughts already with respect to what's the role of digitalization in the decarbonization of the sector. I think what immediately jumps out is that the digitalization is really going to help accelerate the electrification of the industry, and in particular help us kind of build and manage and optimize large distributed generation grids, help deal with the complexity that's associated with the variability, both on a daily basis and on a seasonal basis, of solar and wind generation, and how do you optimize a grid that has lots of different of those assets which are different, and so there's I think a clear view that a lot of these digitalization technologies are fundamental to decarbonizing the electric grid. There's no question about that. And again, I think that's why some of the reason behind some of the numbers that we saw that talk about perhaps a greater impact in the electric power sector than in the traditional oil and gas sector.
Well, Greg, many of these companies globally have made declarations around getting to net zero by 2050. Seems to be the order of the day in terms of the carbon footprinting and the strategies, and maybe even the aspirational goals that many companies have professed. That seems to tie into the entire corporate social responsibility, environmental, social governance. How do you see digitalization enabling that to be realized? And when I say realized, you can say things and then you have to do things. And how can digitalization actually pull that thread completely through so that it's, if you will, demonstrated and demonstrative in terms of the actions taken?
Okay. Yeah, I think we're at the very early days of seeing how some of that might assist. And I'll focus here on the oil and gas companies in terms of their efforts to decarbonize. I think there are a number of digitalization technologies that can help them better understand and the emissions that they have. We've seen a lot of data recently that suggests that, for example, methane emissions from upstream operations and midstream operations, when it's actually directly measured, from the atmosphere via drones and other digitalization technology, is quite a bit higher than a lot of companies had calculated, based on traditional methods. And so I think helping companies have more precision around where the emissions of their operations are can help them, and more complex modeling and help them more rapidly try to reduce those emissions, I think, is one aspect of it. Another thing that people are starting to get interested in, and I think this really applies to natural gas, is the concept of being able to track the sustainable nature, or say the life cycle emissions associated with the production and delivery of natural gas. People are talking about perhaps using technologies like blockchain to be able to actually track molecules. And in fact, we've even seen in some recent LNG tenders, buyers requesting that companies be able to provide that kind of information in terms of, what's been the greenhouse gas emissions kind of particular sources of natural gas. And I think there's a really digitalization technologies are really core to being able to do that. And it's very early days, but there's some interesting things there that I think will also help. So it can be not just the kind of stage 1 and stage 2 emissions of their operations, but it could actually be getting into the emissions associated with the product themselves.
Yeah, let's pull the thread on that just a little bit, Greg. That's an interesting concepts, and so based upon the folks that you're interacting with, or maybe even some of your own personal observations, does the ability to demonstrate that enable you to create competitive advantage and ultimately realize value? Or do you see it becoming the table stakes in the industry that others will have to meet or not be able to participate?
My guess, and I'm not an expert in sustainable energy, thinking or even really strategy, but my guess is that it'll evolve from the former to the latter. That in the early days, it becomes, you'll have leading edge consumers, if you will, start to look at that as a differentiator. And for example, if I'm going to be a buyer of LNG, on a 5-year term contract, that could be a differentiator that could, as part of the decision-making process. Once the technology becomes fairly common, I think it probably then moves more to a table stakes kind of thing. So I think that's important. But I think you mentioned a good point. It's about these technologies being able to help energy providers demonstrate the true sustainable nature of their operations and their products. And like you said, it's one thing for people to make plans and say they're going to get to net zero and everything else. But I think increasingly, some of the larger consumers, as well as, eventually governments, will start demanding demonstration of that. And those are clearly things that would be effectively impossible really to do in any transparent way without the digitalization technologies. And you could imagine, that, there is, transparent tracking of this kind of information that is essentially public, that is stored somewhere that buyers and governments have access to. I know it's very early days, but there are people thinking about how to do that.
Well, Greg, some other questions coming in about the workforce, if you will, not just the workforce of the future, not just students that perhaps in their early parts of their career are learning about these new technologies, et cetera. You have a lot of people in existing workforces that will need the skills to be able to utilize these kinds of new technologies. Was there much discussion with your group around concerns about the existing workforce and continuing education there, and then the ability to attract new talent that is prepared for the workforce of the future?
We did talk about both of those. I think we spent a little more time talking about the second, which is the new talent, because I think there was a belief amongst the symposium participants that there was probably that attracting those people and making sure that they had not only the digitalization and other skills that the energy industry needs, but the energy industry's ability to attract those people. There was a lot of discussion around that, and then there was a lot of discussion around, as a higher education student whose main role is developing effectively mainly new entrants, putting aside some of our graduate students for a moment, into the energy industry. We had a little bit more of a focus on that, and some of the material we showed, which reflected some of Ramanand's thinking about what the disconnect is and how we need to maybe rethink and rechange that. But there was some discussion around the ability of let's say mid-career people, the ability of mid-career people to be able to access on kind of a continuing education basis the knowledge that they need. And I think there was a general consensus that that was not only something that can be done, but that that might be an area where we see a lot of company sponsorship of that, that a lot of that could be self-directed learning programs, and also that, quite frankly, the university ought to be a leading edge provider of those kind of things. So I think there was a view that that is absolutely necessary, that there will be an emerging market for that amongst existing professionals in the energy industry, but that that doing that is not it is not an insurmountable task, and in some respects is maybe easier than us kind of rethinking how we teach, do our core preparation of our students who are entering the workforce for the first time.
Well, Greg, thanks so much. Do you have any closing remarks on anything that we haven't talked about here? I know your white paper is posted on our website. There's a lot of rich depth of information that's there for anyone here, or really any of the colleagues for people that are listening to this website webinar today. Any closing remarks that you can offer in terms of our discussion today?
Well, I think one of the reasons why we were really interested in investigating this topic was not only its potential impact on the existing industry, but its role as a key set of facilitating technologies for the energy transition. I think when you think about, you look at net zero scenarios that are out there for the industry for 2050 and that kind of time frame, it's really impossible to see those coming to fruition or having much probability of fruition without these technologies. And I think that's one thing. Second thing is, and this was a big learning for me personally, the real breadth of these technologies. I think, and many of us, if you talk about digitalization, we could probably name, a handful of technologies. They might be things that we have had experience dealt with, or maybe we've learned. But I think one of the important things is there's a huge breadth of these technologies, and that's really going to increase. Their impact in the long run. And I think it's really important for people to really understand that and kind of internalize it. And and I guess the last thing was really the takeaway for us is, I think that we need to, as people who are preparing students for careers in the energy industry, we probably need to beef up our curriculum. I mean, we have been doing that. I know I can't speak to the other colleges, but certainly in the Bauer Business School, we have been introducing new degree programs and new courses in business analytics and that kind of thing. And so I think we probably need to re-up our efforts in some of those areas as well.
what seems to come out of this conversation is that if you're a young student looking for the workforce activities and challenges in the future, you don't have to go to Google or Amazon. You can go to the energy industry where you can be every bit as technology advanced as perhaps one would be in a NASA or one of those kind of forward thinking kinds of industries that come to mind. The energy industry offers a rich opportunity for all of that. Greg, thanks so much for your discussion today. Going to encourage everyone to go to our website and download Greg's paper. There's a fantastic, again, rich amount of data associated with it. And we'd like to thank all of you for joining today's webinar. I would ask also that as the rest of the month unfurls and we go into June, we're likely to have another of these webinars soon, very likely early part of June on other topics. If you have any suggestions yourself of topics that you'd like to see, we'd certainly love to hear from you and would welcome that feedback. We thank you for participating today, and our thanks go out again to Hunt and Anderson Kurth for their sponsorship of this series through April and this one here in May. And we'll look forward to all of you joining us in the future. Take a look at the website, stay current with what's going on, and we'll look forward to being with you again very soon. So be safe, take care, and we'll be back with you very soon. Thanks.